Okay, it looks like we are live here. This is the first time we've ever done a live stream ever in our lives, so please forgive us as we're kind of learning the ropes as we go along here. So anyway, I'm Jeff, this is Katie, my wife, and we are Frosty Garden. Some of you might be surprised to learn that we're not actually a polar bear wearing a sun hat and having an apron on. We're actual real people and all of that. So anyway, we're going to spend just a couple minutes here chit-chatting, give people a minute to get in and that kind of stuff. We've got a few viewers here, and we appreciate you coming. But anyway, kind of what we wanted to do here is open ourselves up for questions and answers, and it can be anything from our gardens, your gardens. It can be about our operations. Really, put ourselves out there as kind of a resource that you can use to learn more about gardening. So, for those who've been following us for a while, you know that we operate the website frostygarden.com, and we've been doing it now for 8 years, and we're basically a website that is focused exclusively on growing in zones 1 through 4. So there's a ton of information out there on warmer zones, but very little information on colder zones. So anyway, once again, I'm Jeff, this is Katie, and we are Frosty Garden. So we certainly appreciate you showing up, and we'll be taking your questions. So anyway, we do just want to thank everyone for all of your support on our Facebook page and everything like that. You guys have been tremendous, and all the likes and the shares. It's really helped us out, and we don't have an advertising budget. We don't advertise at all, and so when you guys do that, that's a huge bump up for us and what we're trying to do here, which is grow and become a better resource for all of you, really. So I've been gardening for about 25 years. Katie's been gardening for probably about 15. And anyway, we're trying to be good mentors for all of you all. So anyway, once again, thank you for joining us. And I think we'll go ahead and get started here. So the first thing we wanted to do was basically give you kind of an update on our current gardens and where we're at with things. So we did just get started, probably about a month ago, and we've got our onions in, our leeks in. We've got probably about 600 or 700 garden starts that are already on the way. We're about to go into a major transplanting session with a lot of those plants. We've already transplanted out our onions into larger containers, but we've got hundreds more that are going to come in behind that. So things are certainly ramping up, and then now that we're in April, we've got an incredibly busy seeding schedule for the next couple, 3 weekends that are really going to start pushing us pretty hard. So we are also going to be setting up our greenhouse in mid-April, weather permitting, obviously, up here in the subarctic where we're at in Fairbanks. We are very much subject to the conditions of the weather. So some Aprils are really nice and we can see 20-degree temperatures. Some are, hey, we're still flirting with 0 degrees, and it's just not practical for us to heat our greenhouse that early in the season. So we very much are going to play that by ear and kind of see how things generally go. But we're really starting to get into it. We're probably about 6 weeks from starting stuff in the ground. We generally try to get started about 2 weeks before last frost with our raised beds, and we'll do a lot of beets and radish and other cold hardy stuff that doesn't mind the cooler soils. We'll get that in before first frost before last frost, excuse me. And then from there, we'll move into some of our frost-sensitive plants and warm-loving plants. So, and we do generally recommend waiting until after last frost to actually do that. So, one of the things we want to know is, where are all of you from? So if you wouldn't mind telling us, put a comment in the chat there, and tell us where you're watching us from. So we're kind of interested in seeing where we are reaching. And anyway, we know we have people that visit us from all sorts of different places, not just Alaska. We get a fairly good following from places like Scandinavia and Sweden, Norway, that kind of stuff, Canada. So we'd love to know where you're watching us from. So again, kind of what we want this to be is a Q&A. So we'd love it if you would go ahead and ask some questions of us. It can really be anything. It can be about growing. It can be about gardening in general. It can be about greenhouses. If you are a new gardener, maybe some things that you're trying to understand, that kind of stuff. We can generally provide, a lot of guidance based on our fairly extensive history with gardening. And we'd love to kind of talk to you about, what you've got going on. So put those questions in the chat, and pretty soon here I'll have Katie ask any of those questions, and we'll be calling you out and talking to you and all of that. So one other thing, or a couple other things we wanted to talk about was kind of just give you an update on our website. So again, we are the authors of frostygarden.com, and it's a production that we've been working at now for about 8 years. And again, it's focused on zone 1 through 4 gardening. We also can deal with zone 5 and zone 6, but really the core of our effort is zone 1 through 4. A couple of years ago, we kind of shifted the focus away from just Alaska, and specifically interior Alaska, because we kind of realized that was maybe a little short-sighted. And so now we're focusing more just on general northern growing zones and that kind of thing. So that's hopefully starting to reflect in our content on our website. Because we noticed we've gotten a huge number of visitors from places like Canada and other places in the north, right? So, and we're all dealing with the same stuff, really, when it comes right down to it. This year, I've developed a ton of new content for frostygarden.com. There's probably about 8 or 10 new articles. So if it's been a while since you visited us, we'd love it if you stop by and cruise through some of our new content. Some of the topics that we've really dealt with. One was the DIY seedling greenhouse. You guys went nuts over that on the Facebook page. That was quite impressive. But we built a greenhouse out of PVC, and it's worked wonders for us. We've also developed articles on intensive gardening, season extension, reusing container garden soil, a deep dive into photoperiodism, which is huge up here in the north, where we deal with very long light cycles and very short night cycles. So getting a little bit more information about how that works and how it affects different kinds of plants. Wrote an article on winterizing irrigation systems. Also a couple plant-specific articles. One is growing potatoes in the north, and one is growing cilantro and coriander in the north. So we did talk about that a little bit on our Facebook pages last year, but I went into a deeper dive on the coriander and cilantro front, because there's a surprising amount that goes into that particular plant, and it's very much affected by photoperiodism. So, and then we also finally got our garbage bag greenhouse article written. That was a project we did, 3 years ago now, and for some reason it just fell off my list of things to write about, and so we finally got the garbage bag greenhouse article up, and that was a surprising technique to us, that you could just literally wrap a plant in a garbage bag and it actually worked. So we were quite happy about that. So anyway, tons of new content on frostygarden.com. And then we also have a little bit of exclusive information for you here. We started a YouTube channel when we started frostygarden.com, but we haven't really developed any content for it. As you've probably noticed, one with this live stream and also some of the videos that we produced a couple weeks ago, we are starting to actually look at going into YouTube. Or not starting to look at, we are now on YouTube and have videos up. I'll give you a little bit of fair warning. We are not going to be compliant with the YouTube algorithm. We're not going to produce videos every day, maybe not even once a week. Ideally, I'd like to get to maybe once every 2 weeks or maybe once a month. So it'll be fairly slow in its generation. And as you all know, as Alaskans and other Northerners, in the summer, we're so busy. And the last thing we want to be doing is sitting behind a computer developing videos. So, but if you wouldn't mind, we'd love it if you visited our YouTube channel and gave us a subscribe. We are the handle is Frosty Garden 907, and you can also search for Frosty Garden, and you'll find us. You'll just look for the polar bear, and all the branding is there. One of the things that we're trying to do is get to our minimum of 50 subscribers, and what that'll allow us to do is actually start to live stream both to YouTube and to Facebook at the same time. So we would like to start using YouTube a little bit to not just produce shorts and other vlogging type of content, but also put our live streams up there as well. And until we get to 50 subscribers on YouTube, we will be manually uploading the recordings of our live streams. And so anyway, we'd love it if you gave us a like and a subscribe over there. And again, we appreciate and are entirely dependent on all of you helping us, because we just don't have advertising budgets, and we're trying to do this. I mean, we're just a couple of people that are gardeners, right? And putting ourselves out there that with our gardens and everything that we try to do. So anyway, I think that was really most of what I wanted to talk about. So, Katie, are there any questions?
Sure. Anybody want to put any questions in the chat? I see a lot of folks from Fairbanks, Kenai, Kodiak, Delta Junction, more Fairbanksons, Seward, another Kenai, all of our favorite places.
Nice.
Cool.
Yeah, we actually just took a trip down to Soldotna and did a presentation for the Central Peninsula Gardening Club down there. That was a fun event and had a really good turnout. There was, I don't know, probably 120, 130 people that showed up. And anyway, that was a really enjoyable thing for us, and we appreciated all the support from folks that had come out. And it's kind of strange, because we've gotten to this point socially where people know us, but we don't know them. And anyway, it has kind of been a little bit surprising and an enjoyable thing to experience, I guess. So anyway, we did prepare a few questions just in case there weren't any questions. But we would love to see you put some questions in the chat. But we were kind of prepared just in case y'all were shy.
No worries.
And
and so I thought about what are some of the questions that I've been asked recently. And so one of them is, does light or heat matter more for seed germination?
And that's an interesting question, mostly because both really do matter. When it comes to heat, and we're just generally talking about the seed or the temperatures that seeds germinate at, different seeds will germinate at different temperatures. And there's what's called an optimum temperature, which is the most ideal, where you're going to get the fastest germination. But there's generally a good range of temperatures at which seeds will germinate at. So it's not a perfect science, and you have a lot of leeway going in both directions. Anyway, what we've generally found is that room temperature, about 68 degrees, 70 degrees, somewhere in there, is the perfect temperature for pretty much every kind of garden seed that you might be growing out there. So, and that'll handle your warmer climate crops like tomatoes and peppers, and also your cooler climate crops like broccoli and cabbage and all of that kind of stuff. So generally trying to target a good mid temperature is going to be universal for all your seeds. If you're germinating in like a garage or something like that, you might experience troubles with things like tomatoes and peppers, things that prefer a warmer temperature to germinate at. Versus, and that's where you might use like a heat mat or something like that in order to bring up the temperature of your actual seed germination. So as far as light goes, that's a kind of a different thing where basically there are some seeds that absolutely require to be germinated under light. So things like dill and snapdragons and a few other, there's actually quite a few different plants that are all going to require light. What the truth is, though, is that there are no seeds that don't require light. There literally are no seeds that require darkness in order to germinate. All seeds will germinate under light. And so from that perspective, what we do is we germinate everything under light. There's really no good reason for us to create a dark environment for those seeds to germinate. And then we also don't have to get into those nuances of, hey, does this seed germinate well under light or not? We don't have to think about that because all of our garden plants are all grown under light. So you do have to kind of think of them. It's not that one is more important than another. It's that both are important, and our general guidelines is room temperature and germinate everything under light, and that way you just won't experience any problems. And when you go outside of that into cooler temperatures or extremely hot temperatures or try to deal with darkness, that's where you can start to run into problems. Specifically, if you are trying to germinate in a dark environment like a box or something like that, it's very important to get your seeds under light as soon as they germinate. That's very, very important because seeds obviously need light to photosynthesize. And without that, they will not be able to produce the energy that they need to actually grow. And while the seed itself does have a certain amount of energy built into it, it needs the light to continue that growth. So anyway, that would be kind of how I thought about that. Any other questions from the chat? Maybe you got to refresh it a little bit.
Yeah, let me refresh here.
Again, this is our very first live stream, so we appreciate it as we learn, how this works and how we interact with you. But we appreciate all the engagement thus far. So
Totally. Yeah, no questions
All right.
as of yet, but I have another for you, Jeff.
we developed a few questions.
All right, so my tomatoes always crack on the bottom. How do I fix this? Very common question.
Tomato cracking. So almost always the reasons that tomatoes crack is due to insufficient water. Basically, tomatoes are a very water-heavy plant, and when they don't get enough water, either through drought conditions or maybe if you're growing them in containers, it just uses all the water. Tomatoes are both very thirsty and very dependent on water. Obviously, you've eaten a tomato; they're very wet, fleshy fruit, and without that deep watering and constant contact with watering, tomatoes will tend to crack. There are some genetic level issues with tomatoes where some tomatoes are more resistant to cracking and some are less resistant to cracking. But in general, even if you have a non-crack resistant variety, the reason that it's going to crack is because it's drawn out all of the water and there's just not enough left, and it needs really constant contact with water. That's one of the big reasons that we like using sub-irrigation systems in our gardens, in our container gardens specifically, is because that ensures constant contact with water. We've obviously gone through some very advanced stuff where we've centrally irrigated our systems. But as you guys know, or might have seen before, we strongly recommend the Grow Bucket system. That's GRO bucket. And what it is a kit that basically turns a 5-gallon bucket into a sub-irrigated planter. And what's great about those grow buckets is, if you're a beginning gardener and you're trying to learn how to garden, it takes all the complexity of watering and all of that kind of stuff out of the equation. And that's really important for us as larger scale food producers where, we're busy and we don't always have the time to be constantly watering our gardens. And, we also want to do other stuff. We want to go enjoy Alaska and go camping and do other things. And so the Grow Bucket system is a very helpful growing tool, if you will, to grow food in containers and also ensure that constant contact with moisture. And we grow all of our tomatoes in those grow buckets, specifically because it ensures that constant contact with water, and we get very little cracking. We do occasionally get cracking. I mean, it can happen. Again, some tomatoes are more prone to cracking than others, but if you can ensure good constant moisture contact, through regular watering or a sub-irrigation system like we use, generally speaking, you're going to not have nearly as many problems with tomatoes. So again, we'd love to see some questions put in the chat.
Some here.
We got some questions. Good.
Nadia is working on putting some cold crops in containers. She has the starts growing now. Should I put them out before last frost?
So, yes and no. So the safest thing to do is to not put your plants out before first frost or last frost. We've done a lot of experimentation and have obviously pushed that edge. And what we've found with cold crops specifically is that generally about 2 weeks to last frost is a good safe timeline. These are cold hardy plants. If we're talking about broccoli, cabbage, all your cold crops, brassicas, that kind of stuff, they're pretty cold hardy. And even if there's a snow or, a good frost, a good hard frost, we've found that they're generally pretty tolerant. And as long as you understand the cold crop versus a warmer crop kind of thing, it is okay to get into that, hey, I want to put these out a little bit sooner. We almost always plant our brassicas and all of that about 1 to 2 weeks before last frost. So so it is safe, and we've been doing that for many, many years, and we've had no problems. We've also done some experimentations with some of our seedlings where we've actually exposed them to freezing temperatures and even sub-freezing temperatures, and they survive, so while that's not recommended, don't freeze your plants, we've had opportunities where we've tried that, and again, what we're trying to understand is like, how low can you go, right? And what we found is that with those cold hardy crops, we can expose them to freezing temperatures, maybe down to 29, 28 degrees. But ideally, you want to avoid any hard frosts, which are going to be in that 26 degrees and below range. So, what we do also, and here's a good tip, is about 2 weeks to last frost, we look at our 10-day forecast, and basically we say, hey, we are not going to see anything crazy in that 10-day forecast. And while there's 14 days from 2 weeks to last frost to then, chances are good nothing super crazy is going on. So if you do look at those 10-day forecasts, there's absolutely nothing wrong with putting cold hardy crops out in the ground a couple weeks before last frost. I wouldn't push it any sooner than 2 weeks before last frost because you can get some pretty wild swings in temperature and all of that. There's always also a concept we call fool's spring, which is usually sometime in April, sometimes early May for us in zone 2. But usually we're talking about 4 weeks before last frost, where it'll all of a sudden warm up and it feels like spring. And what a lot of newer gardeners do is they'll put their plants out thinking it's safe, and then bam, all of a sudden a good hard frost will come through, 2 or 3 to 4 weeks before last frost, and it wipes out your entire garden. So we do recommend no sooner than 2 weeks to last frost, and that would hopefully that answers your question. And thank you, Nadia. Appreciate you asking the question.
And then Bert wants to know, she's interested in learning how to prune or trim tomatoes.
So pruning and trimming tomatoes is a practice that we do a lot of. What you first have to understand is the difference between a determinate and an indeterminate tomato. So a determinate tomato is basically going to grow more like a bush. It's going to grow to a certain height and a certain width, right? It's not going to continue to grow past usually about 5 or 6 feet, sometimes 7 feet, depending on the variety. An indeterminate tomato is going to grow more like a vine. So it's going to be one single stalk, and then it creates these things called suckers, which is where you have a leaf and the vine, and what'll happen is off of that branch, you will get a new vine that is going to show up. On indeterminate tomatoes, we always recommend removing those vines because the suckers. If you don't remove that sucker, what's going to happen is it's going to turn into another main vine, and pretty soon you're going to have a tomato plant that's going all sorts of hundreds of different directions. That can be really difficult to manage, and so we do recommend doing the suckers. One thing as far as other pruning goes, on determinate tomatoes, we will usually trim off about the lower foot of the actual plant. So usually up to about the first fruit. And we do that mostly to allow good airflow underneath the plant. And we also do that on our indeterminate tomatoes as well. So we really want good air circulation around the top of the soil, because what that's going to do is reduce pests that can get onto your plant. It's going to increase the air circulation, so you're not going to get moisture buildup and that kind of stuff under the plant. And so it's a good idea once the plant is about maybe 2 or 3 feet high to trim the bottom foot or so of the plant. Then another thing that we do on indeterminate tomatoes is we generally, again, are trying to get that one singular vine. So we trim off all of the suckers throughout the season. And then about a month before our first frost, and for us that's usually about August 1st here in Zone 2, what we'll do is we'll actually trim off all of the actual leaves on the plant up to about 2/3 of the plant. So you're making a little poodle dog out of a tomato plant, right? But we'll literally remove all of the individual branches and all the leaves and everything like that. We leave all the fruit, of course, but the bottom 2/3 of the plant. And then we also top the plant. So we actually cut off the growing tip. And what that does to an indeterminate tomato plant is it will basically signal like, hey, growing is done. It can't grow once you cut that top of the plant off. And we're talking the very top of the growing tip, right? And so what that does is it forces the plant into focusing all of its production on maturing the tomatoes. So when you do that, another thing that's going to happen is those suckers are going to start growing like crazy because the tomato just wants to keep growing. So you still have to continue trimming those suckers off of the plant. But really, if you focus on trimming those suckers on the indeterminate tomato and cut the growing tip off and also trim the bottom 2/3 of the plant, what will happen is you'll get very rapid maturation of your tomatoes. So when we started practicing that, it was a night and day difference between the amount of ripe tomatoes versus green tomatoes that we would get. So when we took that aggressive pruning approach, especially that late season, a month before first frost, it really helped us to get a lot more mature tomatoes overall. So anyway, I think do you have anything else to add on that?
For tomato trimming, it helps them just blush out much faster, especially the leaves that are touching the ground. You want to clip those off because that can they'll just start to rot. And then you have potential of disease and mildew that can occur on the plant. So, and it also helps with harvesting. You can see the fruit a lot easier, right. So you're not, something getting away on you. So yeah, it's beneficial, and really just keeping, with sharp pruning shears by them will encourage you to, come by, check them out. We usually do that every few days. We'll go through the greenhouse and just see how everyone's doing. We'll give a trim if we need to. We'll tickle if anybody needs tickling.
Actually, let's talk about that because there's a surprising number of gardeners that don't know how tomatoes functionally create tomatoes, right? So when you have a tomato, it's going to produce a flower. And tomatoes and pretty much all your nightshades, so tomatillos and ground cherries and other varieties in the nightshade, eggplant as well, they're self-pollinating. And so what that means is basically the male bits and the female bits are on the same flower, so the flower can self-pollinate itself. And if you're struggling with your tomatoes not producing actual tomatoes, your problem is almost always that fertilization. So one of the things that we do is we're constantly, we call it tickling the flower, but basically we take our fingers and we go and we gently knock the flowers a little bit across all of our tomatoes. And what that does is it knocks the pollen loose on that flower, and it just goes to the female bits, right? And then that is actually what establishes the tomato. So it's particularly problematic in greenhouses. Outdoors, obviously you have wind and bugs and all that kind of stuff. But if you're growing in a greenhouse and you're struggling with why don't my tomatoes produce, or they produce super late in the season, definitely start doing that self-pollination. And it can be really important, especially up here in the north, because we have lower numbers of pollinators that are about. And so that means that it's less likely that those pollinators are going to reach those flowers. But with your nightshades, you can always self-pollinate and just go tickle those flowers on a regular basis, and it will tremendously step up your tomato production. We do it probably, every 2-3 days while we have flowers being produced. And it's, we always have a tomato produce on every single flower. So anyway, great tip, and surprisingly one that a lot of people that we run into don't actually know. So anyway.
Yeah, sometimes people will get into like using brushes and toothbrushes, but I found you just, give them a little tickle with your ends of your fingers, and that seems adequate.
Yeah, they make little tools that you can buy, and there's just no sense in that when your fingers will work. So any further questions?
Yeah, we have a question from Angie. What's your seeding method for herbs like oregano? Do you start in trays with small cells, then pot up, or do you just seed a bunch in a larger pot?
So we do grow a fair number of herbs, and we generally use what our standard germination techniques. So we use a 200 cell seed germination tray, and so with our herbs, we'll just sow a row of those any herbs that we're growing at that particular time. Most herbs are sowed, I think, about 6 to 7 weeks before last frost. There are a couple of exceptions to that. For example, dill and basil are usually about 5 or 6 weeks to last frost. And then there's one more that I'm forgetting. But
mint is a little early.
Yeah, mint starts super early. That's 10 weeks to last frost. So other than mint and basil and dill, generally speaking, that 6 to 7 weeks before last frost is when we sow them. But we'll sow in the 200 cell tray. Then when they're ready to transplant up, we'll transplant those into what are called 606 jumbo inserts. So that's if you've ever bought a nursery grown vegetable, it comes in these little 6-packs. We use those, and that's what we transplant our herbs into. Herbs typically don't root extremely heavily, so they don't need a huge amount of soil until they grow later in life. If you're growing them in full production, we generally recommend at least 1 gallon to 2 gallons of soil if you're using containers. And we grow all of our herbs in containers, and definitely prefer that. In the north here, it's hugely beneficial to them because it promotes warmer soils, and herbs particularly enjoy warmer soils. So some will produce in cooler soils like in ground and that kind of stuff. But you can run into some problems, especially with things like basil, the warmer loving herbs. Oregano is particularly sensitive. Thyme will grow in the ground. But generally speaking, we do recommend growing herbs in containers. And plus, like for us, we put them right outside of the front door. And so we have this massive herb garden sitting right outside the house. So it encourages us to use them more frequently fresh. And because it's super easy for us to get it, so we can just go out, pick our herbs, and then bring it in and do our cooking with it. So did I answer all the points on that? I think she had...
That we start in trays, then we pot.
Yep.
And then also I would like to add that we've grown oregano in the past. It is one that's really susceptible to early flowering because of the excessive amount of daylight we have.
Right. Marjoram I would also add to that list, and catnip too. Yeah, all three of those plants, oregano, marjoram, and catnip, are sensitive to photoperiodism. So our long daylight in the summer will tend to cause those plants to flower extremely early. If you've grown them, you probably notice like literally 2 to 3 weeks after you transplant outside that they're already starting to flower. It's super frustrating. There's nothing you can do about it. How we've countered that problem is we just grow more of those plants when we want to grow them. So we'll typically, like most herbs, we might grow 4 or 5 of a given herb. If we're growing oregano or marjoram or catnip, and we want to produce some for long-term preservation, typically we'll grow maybe 10 plants or 12 plants, and sometimes even more. So, and with those, because they are kind of annoying, we also try to grow those like every 2 years or every 3 years. We don't do it every season. We try to grow more in a single year and then have enough that we can preserve. And that gets us basically, what we need there. So thank you, April, for your question.
That was Angie.
Angie, sorry.
And then we have Amanda. Do you have a special trick to heat up the soil to plant carrots?
Carrots are not particularly sensitive to cooler soils. They actually prefer cooler soils. In general, like what we were talking about earlier, where if you sow your carrots 2 weeks to last frost, that's a perfect time for your carrots. And they will germinate when the soil temperature is basically ready for them. So there's not really a need that we've found to warm up the soil specifically for carrot germination. You just put them in a couple weeks before last frost, and then they'll come up when they need to. Usually we see them about right around last frost. They take a couple of weeks. And
we do have them in our raised beds.
Yeah, that is one thing that's true.
Because I don't think we've ever grown them like into the soil.
Right. Yeah, and we try to not do direct soils or direct sows in the normal soil, because there's so many weeds and it can be difficult to figure out which one's the carrot and which one's the dandelion. But that is something that we would recommend, even if you were trying to do it in native soils and in ground. We do talk about using what are called wide raised rows or even narrow raised rows. So that's basically where you build up the soil, and usually we're talking about a foot above the normal ground level. And when you do that, it's basically a raised bed, and you just don't have the wood securing the actual bed itself. So if you can raise your soil, you can get all of the benefits of raised beds without necessarily having to go through the expense of building raised beds, because raised beds can be quite expensive, especially with lumber costing what it does these days.
One benefit to the raised beds, though, especially for carrots, is the vole issue, because you can put like some hardware cloth at the bottom to prevent them from coming from the bottom.
Yep.
Yeah,
and speaking of raised beds, I did finally write our article on building raised beds and some of the practices and techniques that we used when we built our raised beds. We did that probably 5 years ago now. And again, we don't have staff here, right? We're doing this on our own, and we don't have writers. I'm the primary author, and so I have to work with the time that I've got, right? So and I while I do enjoy writing, it's you can only do so much of it until it gets a little bit tiresome. So anyway, finally wrote the article on our raised beds and how we built it. We put hardware cloth underneath to prevent voles from burrowing up, and we took a defensive design in our raised bed garden. So we talk about that defensive design and how we integrated defenses against predators of our plants into the design of our garden. So you might find that interesting. And thank you for the question.
Yeah. Shannon is asking, do all seeds need to be started in cells? Or if I have room, can I start seeds in larger containers?
There's nothing wrong with sowing directly into larger containers. We practice the cells and promote that technique for a lot of different reasons. One, we're growing hundreds of garden starts. And so that scales well to our level. And so it is very beneficial for us, where we can just germinate a ton of plants in a very small amount of space. If you're growing a smaller garden, there's absolutely nothing wrong with sowing directly into inserts or directly into pots. The plants will germinate just the same. There's zero difference in how that works. What we have kind of noticed is that sometimes, even we have problems with seed germination. And so if you're sowing into like a 6-pack, for example, and you sow 6 seeds, sometimes you have a problem where like one or two of those seeds don't actually germinate. And so what that creates is basically an amount of space that you have to light and all of that don't have any produce in them. And for us, again, that's more problematic at the larger scale because we only have so much space to work with, and so every little square inch actually counts. So that's why we like going from seed cells and into containers, because we can guarantee that every 6-pack is a full 6-pack. Also, if you're growing like a mix or a variety of flowers, for example, what growing in seed cells or cell trays allows you to do is you can select certain kinds of genetics that you want to bring forward, and that way you don't get all of one particular plant out of your carefully curated mix, right? So it allows you to use physical characteristics to say, hey, I want one of these, and I want one of these, and I want one of those, and that way you get a good mix. But absolutely nothing wrong with sowing into larger containers, and that absolutely would work better for a lot of people. So it's less stuff you need, and but we just show it our way because, well, one, it's the way we do it, and two, it scales well to the level that we're at, where we're growing. I mean, we probably produce 800 garden starts every year, so we've had to scale our systems and our processes up to handle that. So, and those seeding trays work wonderfully for us. There are a few plants that we don't direct sow into seeding trays. For example, squash, melon, typically larger seeds. Those are gonna, once they crack, they're gonna grow extremely fast, and so we will typically sow those into much larger containers directly. So all our squash, everything like that is all handled in larger containers. So anyway, hopefully that answers your question, and thank you for it.
And I was thinking about Amanda's question too about heating up the soil. There are some things you can do. Well, right now there's probably about 3 feet of snow on our garden beds. So you can, just get out there and shovel them off, and so that the sun starts to heat that soil up faster. So especially if you're going to be doing your seeding, that's usually a concern if like my garden's frozen, but I need to get seeds in the ground. So yeah, you can just remove the snow, but make sure it's sunny in that spot that you're gardening so that it heats up. Some people will use wood ash to speed up the heating of the soil. I usually throw my last bucket of wood ash onto my perennial bed. I've never added it to our vegetable beds, but the perennial bed, because it's also right off of our deck, so all of our snow gets scooped onto it. So there's usually a pretty good sized pile of snow, and so we'll just dump that on there. You get a couple sunny days and that pile of snow is gone, and the perennials seem to enjoy the ash.
Yeah, and when we say wood ash, we literally mean the ash out of our wood stove. So it's not a special ingredient, and actually wood ash does have a number of benefits for soil. So that's one of the reasons why we put it on our perennial bed, is because it's actually not only benefiting the snow melt and getting those perennials access to sun sooner, it also has a nutritional benefit to the soil as well. So you don't want to use tons of it, just a little goes a long way. But wood ash is a great ingredient to put in your garden soils. So any further questions?
That's everything I see in the chat. So if you guys have further questions, just add them to the chat. But
yeah, thank you for asking the questions.
questions.
One of my biggest fears was doing this live stream and like nobody was going to be here, or nobody was going to ask anything, and so yeah, we're glad to see. It looks like we've had 10, 11, 12 viewers, and anyway, we appreciate your time, and we figure we'll go for 45 minutes, an hour here, and then wrap things up. So, but yeah, if you have any further questions, we would love to answer them. So, maybe toss one of our pre-prepared questions.
Sure. This one I've been asked before. Can I reuse my potting soil?
Absolutely, yes, you can. So, we have been reusing our potting soil and our container garden soil, potting soil, container garden soil, it's the same kind of thing. We've been reusing it now for at least 8 years. And this is actually a brand new article that I just put up on frostygarden.com this year of basically the processes that we go through in order to do that. But because we run a fairly large container garden, we have almost 110 buckets now. So we're talking hundreds of gallons of container garden soil that we want to reuse. It's not economical if we can't reuse it. But if you think about the question, can you reuse soil? It's actually silly to think that you couldn't reuse soil, right? You know, we in our in-ground gardens, we constantly are reusing the soil. In our raised beds, we're constantly reusing the soil. So it's, yes, you can reuse it. In general, we do what's called a refresh of the soil when we reuse it in the spring. So we'll typically add in compost and other organics into it. We'll also add things like perlite or maybe vermiculite or other, ingredients into that soil that might benefit soil drainage and that kind of stuff. And what we're trying to do is not only renew the nutritional value of that, but it's basically based in organic gardening, right? Where we're, instead of adding soil or adding compost to our our in-ground gardens, we're actually, just doing that for our container garden soil. And it's a little bit different, because instead of just spreading compost over your beds, you're actually adding it into your soil as you're doing your containers. So it does kind of only scale, I think, well to larger quantities of soil. But, if you've got a large container garden, or even a medium-sized one, you don't want to go out and buy, tens of cubic feet of soil every year. That's very, very expensive and incredibly wasteful. So you can absolutely refresh it. We've been doing it now, I think, 7-8 years, and haven't had any problems with like diseases or anything like that. We do, take a little bit of care. If we had a diseased plant in the fall, we're not going to add that soil into our soil storage techniques. So we do take some levels of precaution to make sure that we aren't introducing problems to our soil. But I don't foresee a time where we can't continue to reuse our soil. We're going to keep trying to do it as long as we can. And if we have problems, we'll certainly let you know. But we're 8 years into the practice, and it saved us thousands of dollars in buying new soil. Mm-hmm. So.
Debbie is asking, any other suggestions for something to put on the top of perennial beds to add nutrients to the soil?
Let me think about that. That's a really good question. Mm-hmm. In general, the approach we would take is adding fertilizer, right? Mm-hmm. That's going to be your shortcut and that kind of stuff. But there are some other natural ingredients. We don't practice it, but...
So like when I prep the perennial bed, mm-hmm. Once I throw the wood ash on it and everything melts down and, I'll kind of clean out. I leave the plants there the tops to die off. So we don't clear out in the fall, I'll just do it in the spring. And so I'll clip the dead plant material out, throw that in the compost, and then I'll usually add, I don't know, maybe a gallon or two of compost mm-hmm. To that. And then you can also, because if they're in a bed, they're not receiving natural, because it's not natural soil. I mean, it is natural soil, but it's not in-ground gardening. You can add a little like azomite or a trace mineral so mm-hmm. that those perennials are getting everything that they need. But also perennials are pretty hardy once they get established. They're not as needy as annuals tend to be. Mm-hmm. But yeah, so usually how I prep them is I'll add the compost, any trace mineral, and then they get fertilized and watered, not super frequently, but that once you kind of have some perennials that are happy where they're at, they're pretty resilient and they'll just keep coming. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And there are a couple others that are more natural approaches. Because we don't practice that completely, I'm just failing to remember what there are. But there are some natural things that you can add into soils that will provide a more nutritious basis. I think the problems with them is because they're not, and why we don't practice it is they're not entire in their scope, so they're going to add maybe a little bit of calcium, something like eggshells, certain micronutrients or macronutrients, but they're not going to be comprehensive from what the plants actually need. So we do generally recommend both compost and or fertilizer as a good nutritional basis, because those are going to be more comprehensive from their nutritional standpoint than, say, like adding eggshells, which is just going to add a basic amount of calcium, plus is going to take some time for it to actually break down.
Yeah, sometimes people will add, like food scraps and whatnot, but I just think that's going to cause, it's going to attract animals, the neighborhood dog that's going to, tear up things. So I would avoid that, run a compost pile that you're managing and then use your compost to benefit those beds. I think we answered Bert's question about other additives to the soil. Nadia has a question. I will not have a greenhouse ready till first week of July. Should I still start my tomatoes, cukes, beans, and squash now and just keep them under lights till building is done? Yeah,
so there's a ton of flexibility in when you plant your tomatoes. So typically you have a range of about 5 to 10 weeks before last frost, and we've tried it at 5 weeks and we've tried it at 10 weeks, and we've gotten both greenhouse and outdoor grown tomatoes to produce in that range. Really what it's going to come down to is how much space you have available in your indoor growing space, or however you're actually raising your seeds. Tomatoes will grow very tall very quickly, and that can put a lot of strain on a lot of different garden or growing spaces. If you are growing on like shelves and that kind of stuff, typically what you're going to see, if you plant about 5 to 6 weeks before last frost, your plants will probably be less than a foot. If you plant 7 to 8 weeks, they're going to be about 1.5 to 2 feet tall. If you plant up to 10 weeks before last frost, your plants can be up to about 3 feet tall by the time you get to last frost. So that hopefully gives you a little bit of an idea of what you can expect based on, an early planting versus a late planting. Right now is a perfect time for most people to be sowing their tomatoes. Typically 7 to 8 weeks is what we recommend as a good general guideline for that. But if you're particularly cramped for space, we do recommend waiting for about another week or two to sow them, because they will get very large very fast, and larger plants can be difficult to manage in a nursery type of an environment because they're going to drink more water. They're just huge and take up space. They shade out other plants and can cause gardeners problems.
Plus, there's a risk of, like, when you have these spindly tomatoes and you're having to relocate them, there's always a risk that they can break on you. One thing to note is that if that does happen, if let's say you're moving and transporting a tomato and it breaks, you can, cut it off and it will still grow. It'll be okay, depending on if there's some leaves still on it. But you can take that broken part off and put in some water and propagate it, so you can have another plant that way. People even propagate new tomatoes off their suckers they cut off. So it's another way to get a bunch of tomatoes. Typically, by the time you have suckers, you don't really need to start more tomato plants. But if you just want to have perpetual tomato plants, you can do that. Another thing, maybe for you, Nadia, this year, since it sounds like your greenhouse is going to be starting for you midsummer, looking at some varieties of tomatoes that you can grow outside. We've had great success with a tomato called Stupichka that will mature outside here in Fairbanks. So definitely there's some varieties that you don't need the greenhouse for. So you can maybe play with some cold weather seed varieties this year, and then next year, once you have your greenhouse from the get-go, some varieties that like that heat.
Yeah. But I would also say that getting those tomatoes into the greenhouse will provide benefits, right? So, there's no getting around the fact that tomatoes will mature faster in a warmer environment. So if you can get them into the greenhouse, if you're talking July, you could, if you started them now or around that, you probably are going to have 5 or 6 foot tall tomato plants. Should be fine. I would definitely recommend planting them in like maybe a larger container or something like that. Like probably a minimum of a 5-gallon bucket. Maybe just plan to grow them that way this year, and then next year, if you have raised beds in your greenhouse or whatever it is that you're doing, change the technique then. But you'll have to stake them, and you'll have to support them over that time. But I would definitely try to get them into the greenhouse if you can.
And then beans, you can grow your beans outside too. They'll be all right.
Yep.
You can do them in a container and then bring them in when you're ready. They should be fine. Cucumbers probably be similar to the tomato. They can get a little unwieldy, so just be mindful of how you're growing them and how big you're getting. They're also very susceptible to snapping. And unfortunately, unlike tomatoes, once they're snapped, they're kind of done. So just be very careful and maybe put them... just be aware when you're transporting them. Maybe have a person hold we would do this in the greenhouse too. Like one of us would hold the big, couple gallon bucket, and then the other one would hold the plant, and we, go and
literally transport it.
transport it to its final spot. So they weren't susceptible to breaking.
Yeah, and since you asked about cucumbers, I also want to recommend, if you're thinking about growing cucumbers in a greenhouse, it's very important to look at varieties that are called parthenocarpic. And basically what that means is that the flowers will be self-pollinating. So when you grow cucumbers in a greenhouse, you obviously don't have natural access to pollinators and that kind of thing. And most cucumbers are what is called a monoecious variety. So what monoecious means is basically the pollen, you have male and female flowers, and they're separate from one another. And the pollen has to travel from the male flower to the female flower in order to get a cucumber. Parthenocarpic makes them more like tomatoes, where you actually have the male and female bits on the same flower, and they will self-pollinate. And just like with tomatoes, you can go tickle them, and that pollen will knock off and create a cucumber. It's really important if you're growing cucumbers in a greenhouse to seek out parthenocarpic varieties. Because it will increase your production by a lot. Otherwise, what you're going to have to do is take like a little Q-tip and go into the male plants and then bring the pollen over to the female plants, and it can be quite an ordeal. It's totally doable, and some people like doing that. You can grow some really interesting varieties that are monoecious in a greenhouse, but that's definitely not for everybody, and so we just wanted to throw that out there as something to think about. So also start your cukes 4 to 5 weeks before last frost. They grow fast and
really
big.
fast.
So
same thing with squash. They'll just get really big really fast.
huge.
Bonnie has a question. Do you do your own composting or purchase from local source?
So we do both. We have our own composting system, and there are times where we have problems with things like chickweed and some weeds that unfortunately get into our compost piles. And while we try not to do that, it's kind of just something that happens. And so we generally use our homegrown compost, and we compost with wood chips as our carbon source, and then use all of our greens for our nitrogen source. And we'll use that compost typically at our community garden, where we are going to cover all of those rows with weed fabric, and so we're less concerned about chickweed and dandelions and errant other seeds that might be in our homegrown compost. When we really care about the quality of our soil and we don't want weeds in it, for example, in our raised beds and even our container gardens, we often will buy commercial compost. So and that's just so that we can be relatively certain that, hey, this isn't going to bring a bunch of stuff into our gardens, because we don't have 100% confidence in our homegrown compost, but we produce hundreds of gallons of our own compost every year. It's extremely valuable. We use it. And so we really take that blended approach depending on what it is that our outcome is desired. So
A lot of the sub-aerated buckets, they don't really need a lot of compost added to them either, because the plants are almost growing hydroponically in a way
True.
that their nutrition is really coming from water-based fertilizers that we give them, that they don't necessarily need a ton of, luxury compost. Most of their food's going to come liquid form.
Right. Yep. Definitely. But yeah, you can absolutely compost. You can even hot compost up here in the north. So when we were researching it, it was surprisingly difficult to find information on hot composting up here. But it's absolutely doable. Obviously, you can only do it in the summer, when you can actually get those temperatures and that kind of stuff. But we also have an extensive article on composting in the north and the practices that we use, how we set up a fully sustainable source of nitrogen and carbon sources so that we could basically practice permaculture on our land. And that was definitely something that we desired. We wanted to produce our own compost. And while we do experience quality problems with it sometimes, it's still an extremely valuable product for us. And it also allows us to recycle a lot of our stuff that we create, our lawn clippings and
Food waste.
Food waste, branches that we cut down. And so we're able to process all of that and keep that nutritional structure on our property fully self-sustained. So we definitely encourage you to check out our article if you're interested in more.
Totally.
We are getting pretty close to the end here, but
I will say they also make tools that you can use to sterilize your own compost. They're like steaming harpoons. We don't have one of those, but it is a thing.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a little bit of a dicey topic, and I'm interested in it, but yeah, we'll see.
Last one from Bert. Is there a soils lab in Alaska to run analysis?
Not directly in Alaska that we're aware of. You can get soil testing done through a couple of different places. The Fairbanks Soil and Water Conservation District, I believe, will do soil testing, but I think the actual testing is sent out, and then they get the results back and that kind of thing. I'm not sure if the Community Extension Service is still performing that. They used to, but I've heard rumors that they aren't anymore. But if you're interested in doing it, I've heard that the Fairbanks Soil and Water Conservation District can do soil lab testing.
Excellent. Any last questions?
Yeah. We're getting to about an hour here. We do appreciate all of your patience.
Totally.
And I think we'll go ahead and use this as an opportunity to wrap up here. So kind of our plan with this is we're going to do live streams probably about once a month. If you think that we need to do them more frequently, we will certainly listen to you. But we hope that they grow, and we hope that they're beneficial for you, and we'll have more to talk about as the growing season certainly progresses. We're going to try to aim for around the beginning of the month or the end of the previous month. Obviously, that'll change in June because that's when we're doing our big garden planting. So we'll have to shift that outside of, somewhere, where we're not having an insane amount of work to do. But yeah, look for it through the growing season. We haven't decided if we're going to continue them through the winter. We do kind of like taking a break from gardening and thinking about growing and all of that kind of stuff. We have different hobbies and that kind of stuff that we practice in the winter. And so, we might not. We'll see. But anyway, we just really want to thank everyone for showing up here, and we appreciate your attention and all the likes and the comments that we got, all your great questions. And we look forward to future opportunities, and we'll again announce them on our Facebook page and our website probably about 3 to 4 days in advance, and so you'll have a little bit of heads up that they're coming. And anyway, so thank you again. If you haven't liked us on Facebook and even our YouTube channel, we would love it if you liked us and gave us a subscription there. And again, we're frostytogarden.com, Jeff, and this is Katie, and it was great being with you here today. So thanks much, and have a wonderful day.